I have spent years revisiting nights like this one, nights when the world appears intact from the outside, yet something beneath the surface has already cracked. Nights when a missing child becomes the dividing line between what a family used to be and what they will never return to. But none of those cases carry the weight that surrounds the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Even after all these years, the night of May 3rd, 2007, still refuses to settle. It keeps shifting, it keeps breathing, it keeps pulling investigators back toward a silence that has not been broken since the moment the child vanished. I want you to come with me into that night, not into the frenzy of media coverage that would consume the case later, not into the cloud of speculation that would distort every detail, but into the precise hours when everything changed. To understand a disappearance like this, you must step into the quiet before the storm, when routine feels safe and danger, if it exists at all, is invisible. It is there, in the illusion of safety, where this documentary must begin. Praia da Luz was the kind of beachfront town where the air itself seemed harmless, a place where people walked slowly, where children played outside without fear, where strangers nodded at each other without suspicion. The Ocean Club resort blended seamlessly into this atmosphere. White buildings basking in the sun, pools reflecting late afternoon light, families drifting between the apartments and the dining areas as though nothing bad could ever happen in a place designed for rest and escape. On the surface, it was perfect. Perfection is dangerous in an investigation because it lowers everyone's guard. Inside apartment 5A, the McCann children were settling into their evening routine. Madeleine, 3 years old, was already at the age where her questions were becoming more complex and her energy seemed endless. She was curious and outspoken, a child aware of the world in the way that only bright young minds can be. Her younger siblings, the twins, were quieter, still small enough to fall asleep instantly after a day filled with sun and excitement. The parents moved through the apartment preparing for the evening, unaware that these ordinary tasks would later be dissected, criticized, doubted, and replayed endlessly by people who were not there. They tucked the children into bed, arranged blankets, closed curtains, dimmed lights, whispered goodnight. It was a scene repeated every night by millions of families around the world. But on this night, what followed that moment would rewrite the lives of everyone connected to the case. The McCanns left the apartment at around 8:30 a.m. p.m., heading toward the tapas restaurant where their friends were waiting. The distance between the restaurant and the apartment was small, but distance in a disappearance is not measured in meters. It is measured in opportunity. It is measured in opportunity. It is measured in visibility. It is measured in the number of seconds a child is left unobserved. And in this case, it was measured in a belief that routine checks every 30 minutes would be enough to guarantee safety. I have investigated enough cases to know that danger does not announce itself. It waits in the blind spots, in the spaces where people assume nothing can go wrong, in the exact moment where comfort replaces vigilance. As the parents sat down for dinner, they had no reason to believe their night would become one of the most analyzed nights in modern investigative history. At 9:05 a.m. p.m., Jerry McCann returned to the apartment to check on the children. He later said everything appeared normal. The twins slept deeply. Madeleine was still in her bed. There was no noise, no sign of intrusion, nothing to suggest the quiet of the apartment was anything other than peaceful sleep. He stepped back into the night, unaware that it would be the last confirmed moment when anyone saw Madeleine inside that room. What happened between 9:05 a.m. and 10 o'clock a.m. p.m. is the abyss every investigator tries to cross. It is a space where the truth must exist somewhere, but where no witness, no camera, no recording, no alert system captured it. A window of time that holds the weight of a child's disappearance. At 9:25 p.m., a friend of the family walked past the apartment and thought he saw something unusual, perhaps a door closing, perhaps a figure near the entrance. He dismissed it. People at vacation resorts come and go constantly. Nothing seemed urgent at the time. In investigations, moments dismissed are often the ones that matter most. At 10:00 p.m., Kate McCann approached the apartment for her scheduled check. She expected silence, the familiar stillness of sleeping children. Instead, she entered a room that would never again feel ordinary. The twins were still asleep. Madeleine's bed was empty. Her blanket was crumpled in a way that did not make sense. The window in the children's room was open. A cold breeze cut through the air. In every disappearance case, there is a moment when a parent's voice breaks, when the shock becomes too large to contain, when the world tilts. That moment came when Kate stepped back and shouted for her daughter. The shout carried through the apartment, through the courtyard, across the quiet pool area, into the restaurant, into the ears of people who would remember that sound for the rest of their lives. Madeleine was gone, not wandering, not hiding, not sleepwalking. Gone. Fear does not travel alone. It spreads, it multiplies, it pulls others into its gravity. The friends ran toward the apartment. Staff members fanned out across the property. Neighbors joined in frantic searches. Someone called the local police. Someone else checked the beach. Someone else searched the parking lot. The noise grew and the clarity shrank. When investigators talk about the golden hours, we mean the first hours after a child disappears. These are the hours when evidence is fresh, when tracks are visible, when memories are clear, when the chance of recovery is highest. These hours determine the future of the investigation. The golden hours in this case were already slipping away. By the time police arrived, many people had entered and exited the apartment. Some lifted mattresses, some opened wardrobes, some pulled curtains, some touched window handles. They were searching for a child, not thinking of preserving a crime scene. Their intentions were entirely human, but for an investigator, intentions do not preserve evidence. The apartment was no longer pure. It had absorbed too much panic, too many hands, too many movements. The scene was not secure, and a scene that is not secure begins to forget what happened inside it. The open window became one of the most debated details in the case. Was it opened by an intruder to enter the apartment? Was it opened to exit with the child? Was it opened by someone in chaos after the disappearance? Without a controlled scene, the truth became complicated, fragile, unsteady. This is where the case began to drift from certainty into ambiguity. The first night stretched on. The beach was searched repeatedly. Streets were checked, rooftops examined, nearby properties questioned. Dogs barked in the distance. People whispered theories they were afraid to speak aloud. Suspicion crept quietly into conversations. Was it a kidnapping? Was it an accident? Was someone watching the apartment earlier that day? Was there a stranger at the resort? Did anyone see anything unusual? Questions multiplied. Answers did not. At 1 a.m., search teams were still walking in circles. At 2 a.m., the air grew colder, the silence heavier. Parents in other apartments held their children a little closer. Officers combed through streets that felt emptier each hour. The night swallowed time until the sun threatened the horizon, and somewhere between dusk and dawn, everyone realized the same truth. The child was not returning that night. The world had slipped out of place, and nothing would ever fully return to alignment. When dawn arrived over the Algarve, the case was already fractured. The first night had not produced a suspect. It had not produced a confession. It had not produced a trail strong enough to follow. It had only produced fear, contamination, confusion, and the first hints of a story that would grow into something far larger than anyone present could imagine. This documentary begins here, in that unsteady space between panic and procedure, between hope and dread, between the last moment Madeleine was seen and the expanding silence that followed. Everything that comes next, every suspect, every rumor, every investigation, every theory grows from the soil of this night. The night the world slipped out of place. And as Miller files, I can tell you with certainty, this was only the beginning. There are cases where the investigation grows outward like a tree, branching calmly and methodically as new information emerges. And then there are cases where the investigation splinters, where every new detail cracks the surface instead of strengthening it, where the lines of inquiry twist against one another until they form a maze with no center. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is the second kind. The investigation did not expand. It fractured. When the sun rose over Praia da Luz on the morning of May 4th, 2007, it illuminated a town that no longer felt like a vacation haven. Apartment 5A had transformed from a rental unit into a gravitational point of fear. Officers moved in and out carrying notebooks, radios, plastic evidence bags that remained mostly empty because the night had taken more than it had left behind. The family was exhausted. The tourists were unsettled. The air itself felt heavier. Every investigator knows that the first full day after a disappearance often decides the course of the next decade. It decides which witnesses remain valuable, which leads become cold, which details grow meaningful. But as I analyze the events of that day, I can't help but feel that the case was already slipping out of the hands of those tasked with solving it. The Portuguese police, the Polícia Judiciária, began treating it initially as a missing child case with the possibility of abduction. But possibility is not clarity, and clarity never arrived. One of the early witnesses claimed to have seen a man carrying a small child near the apartment that night. The description was vague, the lighting poor, the details shifting each time they were repeated. Another witness said they saw nothing unusual at all. Another remembered a vehicle. Another heard footsteps. These fragments did not align. They formed a collage of uncertainty. When I study the early reports, I find myself returning to the same question: who was actually in control of the investigation during those first 48 hours? The answer seems to be that no one truly was. The search teams were scattered, the officers overwhelmed, the protocols inconsistent, and behind this unstable structure stood the one unchanging fact: a 3-year-old child had vanished into the night. Around midday, something shifted. The Portuguese police began to suspect that the child might not have been abducted by a stranger. The logic was based on probability. Most missing children are harmed by someone they know, not a stranger lurking in the dark. It is a statistic repeated in every training course, every seminar, every investigative manual. And statistics, when misinterpreted, can become a trap. Police started looking inward into the family. It was subtle at first. Questions about the parents' schedule, their state of mind, their past, their decisions that night. Every answer they gave created room for interpretation, and every interpretation created room for doubt. The media arrived faster than specialized investigators. Cameras appeared in Praia da Luz, as if carried in by the wind. Headlines formed before forensic results did. The world wanted a narrative, and narratives require villains. The simplest story is often the wrong one, but it is the one most easily believed. As I examine the footage from those days, I notice a shift in the McCann's expressions. Shock gave way to something else, not guilt, not deceit, something more subtle. The realization that they were no longer just grieving parents, they were becoming symbols in a global spectacle. They were being watched, measured, judged. Every tear became evidence to some. Every moment without tears became evidence to others. This is the cruel paradox of high-profile cases. The investigation becomes tangled not only by facts, but by the public's hunger for certainty. But the case itself still lacked certainty. Inside apartment 5A, the forensic team struggled. Dusting revealed almost nothing. No fingerprints on the window that could identify a stranger. No fibers or shoe prints indicating forced entry. The bed sheets carried no clear evidence of struggle. The door frames showed no signs of tampering. It was as though the apartment itself had decided to betray the truth. Then, weeks later, came the dogs. 2 highly trained British dogs were brought to Portugal. One specialized in detecting human blood, the other in detecting the scent of a corpse. Their arrival felt like a new chapter, a turning point, a moment where science might finally illuminate what human observation had missed. But what happened next only fractured the investigation further. The dogs alerted inside the apartment. They alerted near a wardrobe. They alerted behind a sofa. Later, they alerted near the trunk of a car rented by the McCanns several weeks after the disappearance. Alerts are not proof. They are signals. They are possibilities wrapped in biological instinct. They require evidence to transform possibility into fact. But the absence of confirming DNA meant the alerts floated like ghosts within the case file, haunting the investigation without grounding it. Some investigators interpreted the alerts as support for an accidental death theory. Others dismissed them entirely. The parents maintained their innocence, pleading with the world to focus on searching for their daughter rather than tearing their lives apart. But public opinion does not respond to pleas. It responds to narrative, and a narrative was forming. As I revisit these records, I am struck by the speed at which the investigation split into parallel universes. Each universe had its own logic, its own believers, its own momentum. In one universe, Madeleine was abducted by a stranger. In another, she died in the apartment. In another, she was trafficked. In another, she wandered off. Each possibility generated its own theories, communities, arguments, and counter-arguments, until the case was not one investigation, but many. What makes this fragmentation so dangerous is not only the confusion it caused, but the time it burned. After the first 72 hours, the trail was no longer warm, the witnesses no longer confident, the forensic data no longer fresh, the timelines no longer consistent, the public no longer neutral. And somewhere within all this noise, the small voice that mattered most, the truth, became harder to hear. Not the disappearance itself, but the unraveling of the investigation meant to find her. A case that needed unity instead became divided. A case that needed clarity instead became clouded by speculation. A case that needed silence instead became drowned in the noise of the world. When I look back on these early fractures, I don't see incompetence. I see a system overwhelmed by the magnitude of a disappearance that should have been simple, but was anything but simple. As Miller files, I can tell you this with certainty. The investigation did not fail because it lacked effort. It failed because it lost shape. It failed because too many people tried to solve it at once. It failed because time moved faster than the truth. And in that gap, the child remained missing. Conti 3 will explore the widening divide between the police, the parents, and the media, and how those fractures reshaped the fate of the case forever. There comes a point in every major investigation when the search for the truth becomes intertwined with something far more dangerous: the search for a story. Stories spread faster than facts. They mold public perception. They influence investigators. They ignite conflict. And in the Madeleine McCann case, the story became a living force that grew larger than the evidence, larger than the town, larger even than the child at its center. Coty 3 is the chronicle of that transformation. The moment when the investigation fractured, not because of what was known, but because of what people believed. As the days passed after Madeleine's disappearance, the police, the parents, and the media stood on three separate islands, each drifting farther from the others. They looked at the same events and saw different meanings. They heard the same statements and reached different conclusions. And the public, watching from afar, chose sides without ever setting foot inside apartment 5A. It began with the Portuguese police, who were under enormous pressure from the government, the public, and eventually the entire world. They needed results. They needed order. They needed order. They needed a suspect. But the evidence was thin, scattered, inconsistent. It told no clear story, and in the absence of a story, suspicion filled the silence. The police began scrutinizing the parents more intently. Their mannerisms became clues. Their interviews became puzzles. Their composed behavior became suspicious to some officers who expected hysteria. But grief does not follow scripts. Some parents collapse. Others freeze. Others lock their emotions in place to survive. Yet in the echo chamber of uncertainty, normal human reactions became interpreted as signs of guilt. Reports circulated behind closed doors suggesting that Kate's calmness felt unusual, that Jerry's assertiveness felt rehearsed, that their medical backgrounds could theoretically allow them to cover their tracks in ways the public could not. None of these suspicions were supported by physical evidence. They grew from interpretation rather than fact. But interpretation, when repeated often enough, gains weight. At the same time, the media storm intensified. Satellite trucks lined the streets of Praia de Luz. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder in the heat, waiting for a soundbite. Headlines flashed across Europe as if the case were a political crisis rather than a missing child investigation. The story evolved by the hour. The most minor detail became breaking news, and as often happens in cases like this, truth and assumption blended. Some newspapers suggested abduction by an international trafficking ring. Others hinted that the parents were hiding something. Some ran contradictory theories on consecutive days. The narrative became fluid, opportunistic, reactive, a storm that fed on uncertainty. Watching these early broadcasts, I can see the shift in real time. The McCann's faces became screens onto which the world projected its fears, biases, and expectations. They were no longer simply a grieving family. They were becoming characters. The case was becoming mythology, and in the center of this growing chaos stood the child whose voice could not be heard. The tension between the police and the parents escalated quietly at first. Questions repeated. Timelines scrutinized. Interactions that once felt cooperative became strained. The McCanns sensed the suspicion. They felt the shift in tone during interviews. They noticed when questions no longer focused on a potential abductor, but on their own decisions, emotions, and credibility. Eventually, communication broke down. When the British police joined the case to assist, their methodology clashed with the Portuguese approach. One side leaned toward behavioral interpretation and probability. The other emphasized forensics and procedural structure. They did not speak the same investigative language, and the gap between them widened with each passing day. In the middle stood the parents, who no longer knew whom to trust or what the investigation was becoming. It was during this period that the cadaver dog's alerts became public, and when information enters the public domain too early, it mutates. The alerts, lacking DNA confirmation, should have been handled with caution. Instead, they became fuel. Headlines declared breakthroughs. Commentators speculated. Forums erupted with certainty based on incomplete data. Suddenly, millions of people felt entitled to their own version of the truth. But here is the reality. The alerts did not conclude anything. They only deepened the rift between two narratives. One narrative claimed Madeleine died in the apartment, suggesting a tragic accident or intentional cover-up. The other insisted she was abducted by a stranger, and that the window and the timing offered opportunity for such an act. Both narratives built momentum, but neither was backed by the type of proof required in a courtroom. When the parents were formally declared argutos, the investigation reached its point of no return. The world interpreted this legal designation as guilt. The media amplified it. The police believed it strengthened their leverage, but the designation produced no confession, no resolution, and no new evidence. All it produced was noise, and noise is the enemy of clarity. The family left Portugal shortly after. Their departure was framed by some as escape, by others as self-preservation. But anyone who studies behavioral analysis knows this. People under immense pressure seek safety, not conflict. They returned to England, not because they were running from the truth, but because the investigation in Portugal had stopped resembling a pursuit of truth. From this distance, the parents tried to reframe the narrative. Interviews, press conferences, statements, asking the public to remain focused on finding their daughter. But the world had already chosen its own storylines. By this point, the case had become a vessel for whatever people wanted to believe. When I study the interviews from this period, I see two parents caught between grief and survival. Not survival from the abductor, but survival from the world that had turned them into suspects, symbols, and subjects of global speculation. Their daughter was missing, yet they were forced to defend themselves in a public arena with no rules. This is where the case transformed completely. It ceased to be a missing child investigation and became a war of narratives. The truth became a variable, not a destination. The investigation became reactive, not strategic. And the longer this war continued, the further away the real perpetrator drifted. Madeleine. In every long-running investigation, there comes a moment when the past returns unexpectedly, carrying with it the possibility that everything people believed about the case has been incomplete. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a forgotten witness, sometimes a misplaced piece of evidence, and sometimes it comes in the form of a man who had been there all along, unnoticed, drifting quietly at the edge of the narrative, like a dark shape beneath the surface of a calm sea. In the Madeleine McCann case, that man was Christian Breckner. Years had passed since the night Madeleine vanished. The investigation was bruised, exhausted, tangled by competing theories and public pressure. The parents returned to England. The Portuguese authorities shelved the case and reopened it. British police launched Operation Grange, pouring fresh manpower and funding into a case that had grown cold but refused to die. Meanwhile, the world kept watching, searching for a revelation that refused to come. Then, more than a decade after the disappearance, the German police stepped into the frame. They introduced a new name with a weight that pulled the entire narrative in a different direction. Christian Breckner, a man whose past was littered with crimes, some petty, some disturbing, some violent. A man who lived near Prada Luz in 2007, drifting between rented rooms, abandoned buildings, and temporary work. A man who knew the area, the routines, the vulnerabilities of the resort town. In the vast, sprawling case file of the Madeleine investigation, his name had appeared before, but lightly, like a shadow passing across a page. It had not been underlined. It had not been circled. It had not been raised to the level of serious consideration. But the passage of time has a peculiar way of sharpening certain details while blurring others. And when Germany reopened the file on Bruckner, the pieces that were once scattered began to align. He was known for breaking into holiday apartments. He had a record of sexual offenses, including crimes involving children. He had been violent with partners. He had stolen, he had lied. He had drifted through Europe, leaving behind a trail of fractured stories and terrified victims. And he had been living just a few minutes from apartment 5A when Madeleine disappeared. For investigators, this was the kind of convergence that demanded attention. A man with a dark past, a man with proximity, a man with opportunity. But opportunity alone is not enough. Investigators need evidence. They need anchors strong enough to hold an entire theory of guilt. And with Bruckner, the anchors appeared, but always just out of reach. One detail stood out first. On the night Madeleine vanished, Bruckner received a phone call within the time window of the disappearance. The signal connected him to a tower near the resort. He was there, present, awake, active. But the phone call itself offered nothing more than presence. It did not reveal intention or action. Then came the witness statements hinting that someone matching his description had been seen lurking near the resort in the days prior, watching, observing, moving quietly. The kind of behavior that in hindsight becomes sinister, though at the time it might have looked like nothing at all. There was also the van, a yellow and white VW camper, old and weathered, often parked near quiet rural roads. A van that could travel unnoticed, that could carry someone away from the scene faster than search teams could respond. A van that some witnesses remembered. A van that Bruckner had access to. When the German police spoke publicly for the first time, they said something that no other authority had ever stated with certainty. They said they believed Madeleine was dead. They said they were investigating a man they considered a killer. They said the case was no longer a question of rescue, but a question of justice. Their tone was different from that of Portugal, different from that of Britain. The Germans spoke with conviction, not hesitation. They gave the sense that they were holding cards not yet revealed. As I study the timeline that connects Bruckner to the events of 2007, the pattern is unmistakable. Yet patterns alone cannot convict a man. Patterns do not replace forensic evidence. Patterns do not speak in the language of courts. Patterns speak in the language of instinct, of investigative logic, of the quiet voice in the back of a detective's mind, whispering that some people orbit crime the way planets orbit suns. But instinct is not evidence. What Germany offered next was chilling. In a conversation with another inmate, Bruckner reportedly bragged that he knew what happened to Madeleine, not in the tone of a confession, but in the tone of someone enjoying the power of knowledge withheld. A kind of psychological cruelty, a shadow tightening around the truth. Yet even this could not be used to convict him. Prison conversations are fragile. They shift, they break, they distort. They do not stand as proof. When investigators searched land connected to Bruckner, they found disturbing items. USB drives buried beneath a property, images and videos that hinted and a mind steeped in darkness. Objects that suggested predatory behavior, but nothing directly linked to Madeleine. The evidence remained circumstantial, haunting but incomplete. This is the curse of Corti 4, a suspect who fits the profile. A suspect at the right place at the right time. A suspect with a history of violence and a pattern of opportunistic crimes. A suspect who does not deny his presence near the scene, but denies everything else. A suspect who seems to orbit the disappearance without ever being pulled fully into its center. Brechner remained silent publicly. Through lawyers, he dismissed the allegations. Behind bars, he offered hints and contradictions. Outside prison walls, investigators pieced together fragments of his life, trying to form a picture that could someday stand in a courtroom. The Germans declared the case open and active. They stated they believed they had the right man, but believing is not proving, and proving is the only language the law understands. What troubles me most when I examine Brechner is not the certainty of his guilt, but the possibility that he might be the closest the case has ever come to an answer that remains intangible, just beyond reach. A silhouette without a face, a confession without words, a truth suspended in fog. As the world listened to the German prosecutors, something shifted again. Hope and despair collided. Some believed the mystery was finally unraveling. Others believed the investigation had found yet another false path. The parents, still searching for their daughter across the years, responded with caution, aware that promises of resolution had come before and dissolved like mist. But for now, the shadow of the drifter remains. There is a moment in every long investigation when you stop searching only for answers and begin searching for meaning. Facts become scarce. Evidence dries into fragments. Witnesses scatter into memory. And what remains is the shape of a mystery that refuses to collapse into certainty. The Madeleine McCann case reached that moment long ago. For nearly 2 decades, the disappearance of one child has become a prism through which the world refracted fear, anger, speculation, and hope. The case has stretched across borders, across cultures, across institutions. It has been reopened, reinterpreted, reframed. It has shaped careers, destroyed reputations, fueled headlines, and ignited arguments in countries far from the small apartment in Portugal where the story began. But beneath all of that noise lies a singular, simple reality. A child disappeared, and the world has been trying to understand how that was possible ever since. When I review the entire timeline as Miller Files, not as a journalist, but as a detective, I return again and again to the silence. The silence of the apartment after 10 p.m., the silence of the street outside, the silence between witness accounts that do not align, the silence in the gaps of the investigation, and the silence inside the truth that no one has yet been able to articulate. Silence is both the enemy and the witness in this case. In the years since the disappearance, every theory has been tested to exhaustion. Abduction by a stranger, accidental death, concealment, trafficking, a targeted crime, a crime of opportunity, a crime that never should have been possible. Each theory has gained believers, lost believers, revived interest, collapsed under scrutiny, and each theory leaves behind shadows of possibility. But what is most striking is that after so much analysis, so many experts, so many investigations and reinvestigations, the truth has not narrowed. It has widened. The more that is studied, the more the edges of the story seem to stretch outward like a net that cannot close. The Portuguese investigation ended without closure. The British investigation continues in cycles of intensity and quiet. The German investigation insists that the key lies in the life of Christian Brechner, yet even they cannot produce the final link, the decisive proof, the undeniable answer. And so the case floats, not solved, not unsolved, suspended. Families of missing children often describe time differently than the rest of us. They do not measure it in days or years, but in distance from the last moment they saw their child. Everything becomes a before and an after. Everything becomes a question of what might still be possible. Hope becomes a kind of geography, a place they occupy even when the world tells them to leave. For the McCanns, that geography has been both refuge and burden. They have carried the weight of a story larger than themselves. They have lived beneath relentless scrutiny. They have fought to keep their daughter's name from fading into the long list of missing children whose faces are remembered only by family. They have lived through accusations, narratives, and suspicions that would have broken other people. And through it all, they have maintained a belief that truth is still reachable. As an investigator, I have learned that truth is sometimes not a moment of discovery, but a horizon, always visible, never fully attainable, a promise that moves forward as you move toward it. The Madeleine case sits precisely on that horizon. What makes this case unforgettable is not only the mystery itself, but what it revealed about society. How quickly people leap to certainty, how eagerly they assign guilt, how deeply they fear randomness, how desperately they seek explanations that absolve them from believing that a child can vanish in an ordinary place on an ordinary night without warning. There is a collective need for answers in this case that goes beyond justice. It is a need for order, for closure, for some reassurance that the world is not as vulnerable as it seems. But unresolved cases force us to confront the fragility of safety, the limits of institutions, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes reality does not bend to narrative. Even now, as I write this final chapter, investigators continue to chase new leads. Data is reanalyzed. Interviews are revisited. Technology advances, allowing old evidence to be examined in new ways. The case may yet shift again. A fragment may surface. A witness may speak. A breakthrough may appear from a place no one expects, or it may remain forever open. The ending of this documentary is not an ending at all. It is a recognition of a truth that investigators rarely admit. Some mysteries outlive the people who try to solve them. Some cases remain like doors that open onto darkness, revealing only what is no longer there. Some stories stay unfinished because the last piece of the puzzle is not lost but never existed in the first place. The world may never know what happened to Madeleine McCann. That possibility is difficult, painful, unacceptable to many, but in the absence of certainty, another truth emerges. A disappearance does not end with an answer. It ends with memory, with vigilance, with the understanding that what we do not know must not erase what we continue to seek. And as Miller files, I leave you with this. Some cases are not about solving a mystery. They are about refusing to stop looking.